Hello, my name is Nathan Brown, and I'm going to show you the NAB K2 SharePoint CAML and search broker that I've built. The purpose of this broker is to allow a SharePoint designer to build highly optimized CAML and search queries that can then be exposed by the broker as service objects that can then be exposed to smart objects. Now, certainly K2 provides some significant out-of-the-box functionality for SharePoint, but for the more advanced situations, having direct control over the CAML and search syntax can provide some significant performance benefits. The entire broker itself is documented in the file you see before you. You can get that and all the source code at this address here on GitHub. But I'm going to step through a couple of these situations. I'm going to skim over some areas that are covered in the documentation, but be sure to read the documentation for some of those details. So let's get right down to it. This broker is broken into two components, the broker itself and then a small configuration utility that's used to build, define, and bundle those into a configuration file. The configuration editor is what you see here. It starts with just a simple title of the file. This allows you to set, or the designer to set, the name of the file so that they can just keep their head on straight when it comes to editing multiple files. Additionally, there's a version number. This is just for the designer. There's no magic behind it. It's just to help keep track of this if you're going to store your information in source control or something like that. So now I can see I've set my first one. Before I create any queries, I must create a folder. Folders are exposed then to K2 as service folders. It's just purely for the designer to help them keep track of the different queries. So I'll just call this folder 1. So I then have selected my folder. I'll now go ahead and create my first query. So behind the scenes, every query has to have a unique query ID. This represents the service object ID that will be exposed to K2. In this case, I'm going to pull against a list of urgencies. A very simple list from SharePoint, urgency list. The name in this case is what's going to be exposed and visible to K2, so making this a human readable value is very is a good idea. The description is then stored in metadata in K2, which isn't very exposed very often in K2, so it's not a required parameter. In this case, there's the site URL and relative URL. Despite what it sounds like, both of them are actually relative URLs to a base URL that we'll define later. This is covered in the documentation, but it basically says that allows for the designer to specify a relative URL from a single base that they can use, a different base rather, that they can use in test and production. This allows you to keep your configuration file static between test and production without having to change any relative site URLs. That's as long as number one, if you have a test environment, and number two, that it's the same as production. So I'm just going to put some relative URLs in here. And these again will get concatenated with my base URL to generate my actual URL that will be used for the query. So in this case, the designer has enough information to actually generate a CAML query for us based on this list. Now again, this tool is not a CAML designer. It's not designed for that. It doesn't have all the bells and whistles that a good designer would have. So it's really designed for either those who are using an external designer or for the real diehards who can just pound out CAML by themselves. So even so, there is also a generate CAML button. Again, this is not supposed to be a designer. This is not the place you would design your CAML queries. But however, if you are able to just pound them out or have a very simple table or list that you're trying to get to, using this generate CAML button can be useful. Since this is the first time I've connected, the designer is prompting me for a URL for me and my sign-in credentials to connect to my SharePoint environment using the URL provided to retrieve information about this list. So I'll go ahead and hit OK. It's then connected to my SharePoint and then read through the columns in my list and brought me back a sample CAML query. Now notice it's got a sample where clause in it. It's got a predefined order by. So this is again very basic CAML, but it's not highly optimized. It may not be what I'm interested in. So this is an example where I wouldn't want to use the out-of-the-box CAML. Instead, I've already pre-written a very small, short, and specific CAML query that it retrieves exactly the columns that I'm after. You know, in K2 and in Smart Objects, it's always a good idea to use to limit the size and scope of your Smart Objects to exactly what you need. In this case, I've got it specifically ordered by, so I'm doing server-side sorting. I might have some additional where clauses in here that would filter just the records I'm after, but more importantly, I'm only returning the view fields that are important to me. So great, I've authored my CAML. My next step is then to go down to the columns section, columns tab down at the bottom, and detect the columns that I'm after. So I'm going to go ahead and press the detect button. Behind the scenes, it has fired off this query. It has actually found 13 rows, or 13 columns rather, of information that SharePoint has returned. As most of you are familiar, SharePoint returns a lot more information than you typically ask for. So it's found 13 columns even though I've just asked for 3, and it's added those columns below. If I expand this window a little bit, you can see that it has brought back all the information, all the columns that I've asked for, plus some other additional information. Now, what I have the opportunity here to do is turn off most of these columns. So I can just hit here the none, and I will deselect all these columns, and instead I just want to bring back the first 3. So those are the only columns that will be then returned to the Smart Object and exposed in K2. Additionally, fields that have a different data type, you can certainly choose and modify the data type that will be exposed. So in this case, I don't want this to be a decimal. I want it to just be a silly number because it's represented as an integer. So then I can, my next step would generally be to test this query and make sure that it's actually returning the data that I think it is. So there's a test button down in the lower left-hand corner. I'm going to go ahead and press that, and sure enough, I'm brought back a list, a small table that describes the rows that will be returned. So in this case, I see the data I'm after. The values that will be returned are highlighted in green, but it is showing me the rest of the columns that the query is returned, even though those won't be returned to K2. So great, I've made my little query. In the upper right-hand corner here, I've glossed over a couple different parameters here. First of which is the max rows. This is the number of rows that will this query will be limited to ever returning from into K2. So if you have a list that has lots and lots of rows, you only want the top 5 or you only want the top 10, however you'd like this configured, this is a resource governor allowing you to limit the output of this query to make sure that you have maintain good performance. Likewise, timeout in seconds allows you to set an additional timeout that will make sure that if you do have any slow performing queries, or if you are at risk and you want to make sure that this again returns quickly, then you can provide the timeout. Lastly, there's the cache seconds, and this is the number of seconds this is going to remain in the cache on the K2 server, and this is covered more in the documentation about how to use this. So I'm just going to go ahead and hit OK. I built my first query. This is all looking fantastic. So I'm just going to go ahead and save my configuration file. So I'm going to go ahead and give this a first name. You can see I've clearly done this, been practicing my first queries. So I'm just going to overwrite this existing file with this one. Okay, so I've got myself a configuration file. My next step, since I've already registered the service broker, is I'm going to go ahead and register myself a service instance. So using K2 Smart Object Tester, as many of you are familiar with, I'm just going to go ahead and create myself a service instance. For this example, I'm going to choose service account. I'm going to do that so that I can show off some of the caching features that are available, but that's covered more in the documentation. Next, I'm required to pick the location of my query store. In this case, that was stored on my C drive in my temp folder. So I'll just type that path in here. The location of this, and this is covered more in the documentation, this location can actually be stored in SharePoint itself. So as long as the service account has access, again, not the service account that's specified here in the authentication mode, but the service account that K2 is actually running under the host server itself, then that can be actually stored in SharePoint itself. Just put the URL here, as long as a network share is also acceptable. But I would suggest someplace where the K2 server only has read-only access. This will prevent the K2 server from actually being able to update this file on its own. Max records, this is a global governor that will allow you to then limit this service instance to only returning 100 rows. This is a global override and will override any value that is provided in any queries. Likewise, the max timeout is, again, a global override. So if you accidentally have a query that's set for a timeout of 30 seconds, this would override it instead of maximum of 15. Lastly, we have our caching value. Again, that's covered more in the documentation. And then finally, lastly, is our this is our SharePoint URL, base URL that will be used in this instance. Again, the purpose of this is to, in a development environment, you can point your URL at the development instance of SharePoint, and then in production, you can point it to your production instance, and doing so would allow you to not change your configuration file between the two instances, and therefore have a pretty good change management process. So naturally, I have to specify the system name and display name, first queries. And there we have it, our instance has been created. So if we explore this, if we open this up, what we will see is this mirrors exactly what we see in our configuration utility, that our folder matches the folder that is provided here, and our urgency list is then provided as our service object, exposes our service object. And if we drill down through and we look at the methods, we see we have a list, urgency list, and we have just the columns that we intended to return, although we saw clearly that more were being returned from that SharePoint query. So let's just create a basic smart object from this. I'll just go ahead and stick that in my development folder and publish this smart object. I'm now going to go down to my newly created smart object, and let's go ahead and execute this and see that it returns information. So I'm just going to go ahead and execute this. Behind the scenes, naturally, it's going out to SharePoint, collecting that information and returning us just these three columns. That's all we asked for, and there we see it. Notice here that this took about 0.7 seconds. Oh, that's pretty good. That's not ideal response time, but the use case, one of the best use cases for this broker is for lists like this, which are both ridiculously simple and might be used a lot all over the place in your K2 environment. It's very convenient to store some of these things in SharePoint, not having them stay stored in a smart object or a smart box object. There's some real advantages, both change management wise, permission wise, to storing these into a SharePoint list. But this performance is not really adequate if this was going to be used hundreds of thousands of times a day by many users. So in this case, because we activated caching, this has actually stored these values locally on the K2 server. And this isn't very much data, so its cache can remain small. So when we execute this again, notice now that we're down to 0.01 seconds. So that's quite a performance improvement. So if we keep executing this, we now see that this is a much faster execution time because it's able to retrieve these values from its cache and just locally to the K2 server. So it doesn't have to re-authenticate to SharePoint. It doesn't have to re-pull that data. If you're using a SharePoint Online, this can be a big time saver from pulling that information local to your K2 environment. So this includes the first of several demos. Next, I'll be covering how you can add parameters to your queries and further then expanding on SharePoint search.